So look, first thing I want to do is I want to talk qualitatively a little bit about like giving us a bit more appreciation for why it is damn difficult to go from product market fit to go to market fit. And the argument and the description I'm going to be giving you right now, it comes from, or is maybe best explained by Jeffrey Moore. By the way, I think I talked about Moore's law in our first lecture or second lecture, I don't remember. This is not Moore of Moore's law. So Moore of Moore's law is Gordon Moore. He was one of the co-founders of Intel. Jeffrey Moore is a VC and a writer. He used to be a VC at Moore Davidow, and also he is not the Moore in Moore Davidow. You can see that it's written different. But honestly, he's best known as a writer and a thought leader on startup strategy in Silicon Valley. He's written 2 books that are notable. The first one was Crossing the Chasm. He's also written and that one's hugely impactful, and that's why I talk about a basic summary of the main points of that book here today. He also wrote a second book called In the Eye, I think it's called In the Eye of the Tornado, which is actually a book that's about phase 3. Okay. I think at this stage, Crossing the Chasm, which is a book about phase 2, is the more impactful one so far. I highly encourage folks who are interested in sales and marketing for startups that they check that out. It's a bit of a dry read. It's not as easy to read as Eric Ries's book, but it's not a technical book. So let me explain what Crossing the Chasm emphasizes and kind of the challenge that it illustrates. Look, the most important thing is that Crossing the Chasm makes a distinction between the early segments of a market and the mainstream market. And it makes the observation, by the way, what is the early part of the market? It's, generally speaking, technology enthusiasts and visionaries. What's a technology enthusiast? It's someone that is happy to test your product, even though, they know you're not sure your product's good yet. They're not fooled in your big words saying this is awesome. They're not fooled by that. They're like, yeah, we know that they have no clue if it's awesome. It's probably going to have a bunch of problems with it. But you know what? When they, test the product out, they're more than happy to test something that may end up being a dud. In fact, for them, it's part of the thrill of it. For them, consumption is like experimentation for themselves, and there's a joy to experimentation. They love being the first person that tested out this device, yada, yada, yada. It's part of their identity. They're curious, they don't need something to be a sure bet that it'll be awesome, right? So I say technology enthusiast, but someone could be a cultural enthusiast, right? Depending on what you're selling, it doesn't need to be technology per se, but it's the people who are game, willing to try something before others do, even if it could be a dud. Most human beings are not like that, right? What are visionaries? Visionaries are people look, they know the thing is probably not awesome yet, but the bar for getting them to test is a little bit higher than an enthusiast, right? Who gets a thrill out of testing something. They kind of want to see a path to this being good. And so you really need to communicate your vision beyond just the detail of the product and get them on board with it. Right? So when they're on board with what you're trying to get to, they're okay, let's give it a go. And you know what? Sometimes these visionaries and technology enthusiasts are like this as well, is they'll work with you. So not only will they buy the product or try the product, they'll be sometimes they'll be happy to give you feedback. They're it ain't doing it for me because of this and that. So you want to listen to them a lot. Again, right? Most people are not like this. And so it's not accidental that this distribution, if we think of this as a distribution of customer types, the area under the curve here is not big. And why am I pointing this out? If all you ever do is you get the early market, you do not reach the upside you were aiming for. Right? So even if you kill it here, you have not become a successful startup. Do we all agree? Or can we all kind of accept that? In other words, for you to reach your upside, you must successfully penetrate the mainstream market. But the problem with the mainstream market is, look, there's a difference between a technology enthusiast and a visionary. The visionary, you need to get them to buy into the vision, right? But like, yeah, that's a difference. That difference pales in comparison to the difference between visionaries and the mainstream market, right? And look, I'm not going to give a summary of the entire Crossing the Chasm book, but what I will do is I'll give you guys a distinction between visionaries and the early stage of the mainstream market, like the first members of the mainstream market that startups typically focus on, because those are the ones that are most likely to be gettable early on. And these are what Moore calls the pragmatists. Now, pragmatists, it's a good labeling. What a pragmatist does is they're willing to buy the product if they believe you have proven or sufficiently proven the value prop. So them saying like, I kind of see the vision, so I see a path where there could be a value prop. No, that's not good enough. They're like, show me the value prop. Only once I really believe you've got the value prop kind of proven will I go for this. By the way, when I say that, you might start thinking to yourself, like, wait a second, Jiro, once you've proven that, won't the whole world come to you? The answer is no, because there's also conservatives. Conservatives, you can prove it to them, but then they're like, sounds like a lot of work. Nah, I'll take a pass. Skeptics are just like, I don't believe anything you say, right? So even though you don't get the whole mainstream market, even once you can document very cleanly in a credible manner the value prop. So it's useful to think who the pragmatists are and who tend to not be pragmatists, because I think a lot of folks might just think once you prove the value prop, everyone should come. And no, it's not that easy. But think about the difference between the visionary and the pragmatist. I mean, there's a big gap between someone sees a path to value prop versus someone believes the value prop because you've made a good argument based off of things that are measurable that the value prop is there. Right? It's not enough to say, hey, call the visionaries and ask them if they're happy. Like that's not the burden of proof is higher than that. By the way, so I'm not sure, I'm guessing some of you guys follow some startups on LinkedIn. If you don't, you should, right? And if you do, you may have noticed sometimes some of the key employees at the startup, like if it's a young enough startup, like the CEO, someone that's kind of heavily involved in product or in sales and stuff like they might post on LinkedIn sometimes, like a short report. That's a report like explaining like, oh, this is how this company used our product, right? That's a telltale sign that these companies are in the search for go-to-market fit, because that is them trying to make the case that they're offering a value prop to the pragmatists. And what you'll see sometimes is they actually kind of make a few reports over time. So like 1 month, they post a report. And then you look 2 months later, they post another report with the same company, but the documents changed a little bit. That's them trying to find, zone their way into how do we document this value prop with a real world example in a way that will resonate with the pragmatists. That takes time, and it takes a whole set of learning. Because once people say, hey, I like it, I'm going to continue using the product, zoning into what's fundamentally useful about that product to that customer, and getting a feel for to what extent that's a homogeneous value prop to the other parts of the market that you want to get, like that's a real problem solving exercise. It requires some detective work. It requires, stuff like that. And so, yeah, this is like actually difficult to do. And by the way, you need to kind of sift through the mainstream market and try to identify who's likely to be a pragmatist versus who's likely to be a conservative or a skeptic. Because, the conservative and the skeptic are unlikely to be the ones that you cross the chasm to. They call it crossing the chasm because of the big difference between the visionaries and the pragmatists. It's a lot harder to hop from these folks to these folks than it is from these folks to these folks. And so this is like a graveyard for so many startups, including so many startups that actually had a good product. So by the way, if you guys ever read the Gordon Moore book, Jeffrey Moore book, like he talks about some tactical strategies on how you navigate crossing the chasm. He focuses on the sector that he knows best, which is enterprise software. And he wrote the book kind of before the cloud. So it was when it was like the world of on-premise software, right? But he talks a little bit about, like, for instance, who are the usual suspects in this market as pragmatists. Because, let me tell you one thing, like when someone thinks that they've got a value prop for enterprise, and they decide, and they need to decide which enterprise in my vertical, because now, I'm talking about selling to business. You are a startup that sells to other companies. Let's say you've got like software that is relevant to a particular industry. So you look at companies in that industry. Maybe you sell some software that's useful in financial services. So you find, let's say banks, let's make it simple, banks, right? So you are selling to banks. You need to decide which banks should I reach out to and try to sell this product to. Well, one thing you might do is you say, let me focus on the big fish first. Because usually when we sell software, it's pay as a function of usage. And so the bigger the fish, the more sushi or something like that, right? Like you'll make more money from each big customer you get than each medium or small customer. And so you might be tempted to say, like, we should focus on the big folks first, because that's going to move the needle the most. Like, that's one hypothesis. It turns out that doesn't tend to work well in practice. The history of go-to-market for startups has been more about focusing on something different. It's not focusing on the small fish either. In enterprise, it's focusing on a particular type of medium fish, right? So in banking, like medium-sized banks that have been recently growing, so that they were small, in the not so distant past, they've been growing aggressively and are now medium-sized. Basically, you look at their pace of growth, it's a proxy for their ambition. And so if they have grown from small to medium, their goal is probably to grow large. And then the value prop that you want to offer to them is you want to try to convince them, hey, if you use our product, it'll help you on your path to becoming large. So that you try to like sell your product as being something that advances their ambition, that serves as a bit of a change agent for them. So you say, like, you know what, if you adopt us, this will give you a strategic advantage, some sort of advantage relative to the large folks who are not adopting us. The large folks, they don't tend to be pragmatists. They tend to be conservatives because things are already rolling well for them. Why bother rocking the boat? So they tend to be like, yeah, we'll wait and see. Like, we don't see why we need your product to preserve our position. So they say like, no, not now. But like, if you convince the medium person that's going for them, like, we will help you go for them, boom, that's them being pragmatists. So like medium, but on a high growth trajectory. So like was small, now medium. I mean, you could almost call it like a startup in that industry. So startups start selling to startups is a thing, right? Like those tend to be the pragmatists. By the way, generally speaking, I would say like not everyone will agree with this statement, and it, by no means is this a golden rule. It's more of a rule of thumb. But as a rule of thumb, I would say the chasm is probably larger in enterprise markets than consumer markets. But again, I still think there's a chasm in consumer markets, mainly because an element of this difference between pragmatist and visionary is like inherently social, right? And if you want to see an example of this in the Jeffrey Moore slide, I have a YouTube video, click on it. I'm not going to click it here. It's like a 5-minute video. Watch it 2x speed, that's 2.5 minutes. It's literally like a real-time social illustration of crossing the chasm and how it's difficult to cross the chasm at first, but that also illustrates that once you cross the chasm successfully, boy, oh boy, do things start to speed up fast. And so my view is it also exists in consumer, but it's probably more complex in enterprise, to be honest. But again, this is just one way to highlight, like, you getting people happy and using things in this market in search for product market fit just doesn't get you that scalable, repeatable go to market, because those folks are the folks you need are so different. Any questions about this so far? Yes, Zoe, go ahead.
I'm just a little bit confused about the medium-sized fish example you just gave. I'm wondering if it's referring to pragmatists, which you did mention, or if it's more so referring to a strategy that a company adopts in order to kind of capture the pragmatist. I guess what I'm confused about is which angle are we looking at this?
I mean, the reality is it's both, right? It's like you need to find the medium fish that are growing fast. And then you need to kind of like learn a little bit about them and know enough about the visionaries you got earlier to be able to find the commonality between the two, so that you can credibly convey, something that you can verify, that can be verified worked for your earlier customers, that will be valued by these customers. And usually the thing that they will value the most and want to adopt the fastest is the stuff that aligns with their ambition. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but like, I think what you were saying is like, am I referring to like how you try to prove the value prop or how you try to identify the pragmatist? And I would say like those two things are interrelated. They are interrelated. So
got it. Thank you.
And by the way, like, I realize, like, I'm saying this to you, it feels a bit abstract. The reality is what this exactly means on a case-by-case basis is going to be different. That there are no there are no universal laws to kind of put here that are precise. Like, to me, it's much more important that what I'm trying to emphasize here more is like the key questions you need to solve as opposed to the answers to those questions. Because the answers will be different everywhere. But you'd be amazed how often people don't ask the right questions, and as a result, go down a totally wrong path. So it's more about being question provoking than answer providing. I think if I claimed I had a universal answer, you should call me on the bullshit. Come on, that would make no sense, right? Now, any questions about this so far? So some of what I've said, I've kind of laid out here, right? So it's about heterogeneity in customers, but more importantly, like a big discontinuity between these customers and these ones.